Owens Corning wants to help you be a successful, productive, and high-quality insulation contractor. In this video, we'll cover the most critical aspects for fiberglass batt installation that directly affect whether a job does or does not meet the requirements of the California Energy Code's Quality Insulation Installation, known as QII, and whether it passes or fails inspection. We'll show you the correct methods for installing Owens Corning EcoTouch batts to help you meet the expectations of the energy rater, the building inspector, and the general contractor on each and every job. Originally part of the California Energy Star Homes voluntary program, with the implementation of the 2013 California Energy Code, the QII requirements will be a compliance option within the performance approach for all new construction in the state of California. So for those choosing the performance approach, it is critical that batts be properly installed the first time, every time. It assures the insulation will pass inspection and helps eliminate callbacks. So what does QII mean? It involves an evaluation by a certified home energy rater who follows criteria set forth in California Title 24, Part 6, Residential Appendix 3.5. The result of the evaluation is pass or failure. Just as with other building inspections, failures must be remedied before the house receives a certificate of occupancy. Owens Corning recently commissioned a very extensive independent study of home energy raters and residential building inspectors to understand what issues they most typically encounter when rating or inspecting a new home. We'll share these results with you as we walk through each of the critical steps in a proper installation. One of the most critical applications to cover is wall insulation. Walls are typically the first area to be viewed and inspected. They form the first impression for both the building inspector and the energy rater. We have heard building inspectors say that neatness counts, so take care to install this insulation neatly and properly to avoid failures and callbacks. There are 4 keys to proper wall batt installation. Number 1, fill the cavity top to bottom, side to side, and back to front. Number 2, leave no gaps between the insulation and framing members, studs, and top and bottom plates. Number 3, split around wiring. And number 4, insulate behind electrical boxes and other voids created by cavity obstructions. So first, fill the cavity. In order to meet QII requirements, you must assure that the insulation batt fully fills at least 90% of the area of the wall cavities. Small voids less than 3/4 inch deep on the front or back of the insulation are allowed, as long as the total void area is no more than 10% of the batt surface area. Our survey found that a failure to properly fill the wall cavities resulted in a failure by the energy rater on more than 20% of all jobs rated. You can clearly see that this installation resulted in thin spots that could be cause for failing to meet QII requirements. Second, any gaps between the insulation batt and the wall studs, top plate, or bottom plate can be cause for failing inspection. When cutting a batt to length for a short cavity, cut the batt about 1/2 inch longer than the cavity. This will allow you to fully fill that cavity without tucking the batt at the bottom. Notice that this cavity is properly filled without tucking. If a batt is too long and tucked in at the bottom, such as we see here, it can cause your installation job to be downgraded. The same is true when cutting batts for a narrow cavity. Cut the batt neatly and evenly about 1/2 inch wider than the cavity to ensure a snug fit with no buckling. Here we see a properly cut batt that neatly fills the width of the cavity. And here we see a poorly cut batt that leaves gaps along the edges. Our survey found that gaps around the insulation are the single biggest reason for a building inspector to fail a job. More than 1/4 of jobs were failed by both energy raters and building inspectors due to gaps along the edges of the insulation. If energy raters or building inspectors can see the exterior sheathing material when evaluating insulation installation, such as we see here, this would be cause for failing inspection. Third, you must split around wires. The QII guidelines also refer to this as delaminating. Our survey found that energy raters will not pass an installation for failing to split around wires on more than 30% of jobs inspected. This is the number one reason for failing insulation inspections. Splitting around wiring is not difficult. One technique is to simply split the bottom of the batt and tuck it behind the wiring. A second technique is to slash the back of the batt and tuck that behind the wiring as well. Finally, you must take care to cut insulation neatly around electrical receptacles, pipes, and any other obstructions in a wall cavity, rather than shoving it behind the obstruction and creating an area of compression behind and gaps around the obstruction. Energy raters found this defect on more than 20% of job sites inspected. The cutout can be used to fill the void behind the obstruction. So far, we've been showing you how to properly install unfaced batts. When installing craft-faced batts, there are additional details that are critical to meeting QII requirements. First, understand that fiberglass batts may be installed by friction fitting, face stapling, or inset stapling. All are broadly accepted practices, but be certain to understand any differences in local practices or expectations. Of course, the fastest, most productive method is friction fitting. Owens Corning's patented ProPink FastBatt product is a particularly good choice. When friction fitting faced batts, be certain that the edge of the facing is even with the face of the wall stud. By friction fitting your batts, it also allows the inspector to check behind the batts for splitting around wiring and full cavity fill without damaging the product. When face stapling, simply open the flanges and overlap them onto the face of the wall stud. Inset stapling is acceptable within the QII guidelines as long as the void created by the flange inset does not extend more than 2 inches from the stud on each side. If inset stapling, be certain that the edge of the stapling flange is even with the face of the wall stud. Don't push the edge of the batt further back into the cavity. Be certain that the flange is stapled smoothly along the edge of the stud without buckling. In all cases, repair any tears in the facing to maintain its vapor-retarding performance. Hopefully, this has been helpful in assuring all requirements of the QII are met for your installation of fiberglass batts and exterior walls. There are other critical applications in the home that can be cause for failing inspection or falling short of the QII requirements. Let's talk about a few of those as well. For floor systems, the insulation must maintain permanent contact with the air barrier, usually the subfloor decking above. This can be achieved by either using a full cavity depth insulation with wire mesh or twine fastened to the bottom of the floor joists, or less than full cavity depth insulation with wire supports to keep the insulation in place. Take care of using wire supports that they do not unduly compress the insulation. Be certain that attic insulation recovers to at least the label thickness to assure you deliver full R value to your customers. Our survey found that 1 in 10 jobs were failed by energy raters because of thin attic insulation, and 1 in 20 jobs failed to pass the building inspection for this defect. Know the label thickness for the batts that you're installing and provide sufficient handling to assure that they fully recover. Properly fit the insulation around bracing and other obstructions, such as wiring and plumbing, just as you did for wall applications. Access panels and/or drop-down stairs to attics should be weather-stripped and insulated to the same R value as the surrounding area. Knee walls should be insulated and backed with an air-impermeable material to provide closure and prevent wind washing. Other situations the builder should keep in mind are capping and sealing all vertical chases and providing a sealed hard cover over dropped ceilings and soffits, cantilevered floor cavities, Be certain they're insulated before closing them in with rigid sheathing. Shower stalls, bathtubs, or fireplaces. Make certain that insulation is installed behind them when they're adjacent to exterior, attic, or party walls. A rigid sheathing or other material should then be installed to hold this insulation permanently in place. You should now be armed with the knowledge you need to meet the QII requirements the first time, every time.